I get to say good morning again. You know, I always like to start out with a question. So what is orange and sounds like a parrot? A carrot? They don't get any better. They do not get better. Hey, we started talking last week about spiritual warfare, and I'll touch on some of the same things we talked about last week, but I wanted to kind of expand on what we talked about. I'm told that for a price that you can play war games, that there's a place where you can go and you can experience simulated war. You go and you join a group of about 12 or 15 people and you play war. It's kind of like a week at Disney for men. And you have to sign these waivers saying that you won't sue them if you get hurt in any way. So, I mean, it sounds a little more serious than just going to Disney. They dress the participants in military gear. They give them weapons that shoot blanks and grenades. And they basically, that are basically flares. And they drop you off in what looks like an abandoned village at night. And all at once, a half dozen Chinook and Apache helicopters come in, and soldiers rappel out of these helicopters, and they're wearing night vision goggles, and there's tremendous gunfire, and all of a sudden, the military trucks around the area start to explode. They've been rigged with pyrotechnics, and all of the participants, they scurry for cover. Immediately, the soldiers start throwing these flash bang grenades, and the sound is just deafening, overpowering. For many of the participants, their main instinct takes over. Many of them run and hide. These were the guys that couldn't wait to play war. Now they run and hide. See, many of the participants thought of this as a fun time, playing war with the boys. Thought of this as somewhat of a playground. We used that word last week, when in actuality it was more like a battleground. People thought it would be fun, and pretty quickly it wasn't so fun. And the whole thing breaks down pretty quickly because it wasn't real. It was only simulation. So how much more of a panic? How much more if it would have been real? So here's what I want to ask you. Would you say your approach to Christian life is more of a playground or more of a battleground? We asked that question last Sunday. Most of us culturally, we treat it kind of like a playground. But I think the Bible teaches us it's more like a battleground. In fact, there's a war taking place around us, and there are unseen forces that battle. Let me say it this way for us today. If you're on a battleground, but you act like you're on a playground, you are going to put yourself and everyone around you in danger. Yeah, if you're on a battleground, but you're living like you're on a playground, you and everyone around you are in danger. There will be some collateral damage. The people in your circle are going to pay the price. The people for which you're responsible will be put at risk. Now, the Bible challenges us to understand that there is war being waged all around us. If you're on a playground, you're generally there to play. You're there to just have fun. It's carefree. You go down the slide and you swing on the swings, and time is of no consequence. You're not really there for any purpose or mission that you're trying to accomplish. You're just there to enjoy yourself. Playing with the people who are there, and everything on the playground, everything there is for your enjoyment and your entertainment. And that's the playground approach to life. But I think the battleground is different. With the battleground, there is a constant hyper-awareness. There's this awake mentality, and you're alert. There's an enemy you're watching out for, yourself and those around you. And you start to form a bond with the people who are also in the fight with you, where you have a common enemy and you're fighting for a common mission. And people are counting on you, and time is important. And you want to know your enemy? Well, you gotta know your enemy. Old-time preacher Charles Spurgeon said this one time. He said, "When you sleep, remember that you are resting on a battlefield." Don't forget that. When you travel, suspect an ambush at every hedge. There should be this awake and alert spirit that we have. So I ask us, do I approach the Christian life more like a playground or like a battleground? Are we fully engaged in the spiritual war that's being fought? Today we'll again look at Ephesians chapter 6. Here's the background. The Apostle Paul is in Rome and he's writing to Christians in Ephesus. He's in prison, likely chained to a Roman guard. And so he knows what it is to have an enemy. He's chained to the enemy. That's what you would think. And yet that's not who he sees as his enemy. He understands that there is something more significant than the flesh and blood guard that he's been chained to. That there is a different enemy of which he needs to be aware. Here's Ephesians chapter 6 and verses 10 to 12. Paul says, and he starts up by saying, finally. Finally. Paul was at the end of the letter. He's taught the Ephesians about who they are in Jesus. He begins the book of Ephesians with teaching them of their identity in Jesus. You're sons and daughters of God. You're citizens of heaven. And then starting in chapter 4, he tells them how they should live. Because this is who you are, this is how you should live. It's identity and then behavior. Yeah, it's your identity first and then your behavior. Now, some of us grew up in church where they talked a lot about behavior and they didn't deal so much with the identity part. It was all about being a good boy or girl, and that doesn't always work well for very long. So Paul in Ephesians begins with identity and he moves to behavior. And now he's saying, finally. Finally, I'm going to tell you how to live out this identity, this behavior. He says this, finally, be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. That's where the power is found. Put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood. Remember when we used the word struggle, it was a wrestling term to hand-to-hand combat, rolling around in the dirt struggle. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. So, verse 12, our battle is not against flesh and blood. It might seem like it, but Paul says there's something more happening here. You might think that your battle is purely physical. The addiction you're trying to conquer, the relationship you're trying to save, the culture you're trying to impact, all might seem very much flesh and blood. But Paul says there's something more at play here. There are spiritual forces at battle in the heavenly realms. And so he references an enemy. The Bible talks about the devil or Satan. And not all believe in a spiritual being called the devil or Satan. Some think it's sort of metaphorical. Like when I say devil, they think it's a metaphor for evil. And I get that. But we know there's a spiritual being called the devil. And he would love nothing more than for you to think of him metaphorically. Now you can kind of go to any continent, and this is not a difficult thing to understand. But in our Western world, in our modern mindset, we like to think we're a little more sophisticated than the idea of the devil. A guy wearing red yoga pants and carrying a pitchfork. Culturally, we're beyond that. I actually had somebody one time tell me, we were talking about Satan, and after the message said, that's just all a big misunderstanding. Satan is a misunderstanding. Yet the Bible makes it clear that we have an enemy, a spiritual being. And this world is more than just physical flesh and blood. And even the most skeptic knows that that's true. That there is another realm. That there are spiritual battles taking place. Now we have a hard time accepting that because it takes power away from us. Because if it's flesh and blood problems, then we can come up with flesh and blood solutions. And it appeals to our humanistic approach to life. And so we say, here's what's broken, and if I can understand this flesh and blood problem, I'm not going to say that anymore, I can fix it. And so we say, well, poverty, well, that's an education problem, and violence is a gun problem, and depression and addictions, they're all psychological problems. And so we try and fix all these things with flesh and blood solutions. Now, I'm not saying that these things shouldn't be addressed by flesh and blood solutions, but there's something more to it. We're fooling ourselves if we think social and economic equality is going to take care of all of our problems. Or if we think social reform or political action or medical advancements are going to fix all these things. That's not how it works. And maybe we're becoming more aware of this as a society. Because we see problems that should have rationally been taken care of a long time ago. Things like racism. Like, how are we not beyond that as a society and a culture? Yet it's still a struggle. Why is that? It's because we have an enemy. There's something in the heart of man that causes us to turn against one another, that causes hate and bitterness. And we should address the symptoms, but we should understand that there's something else deeper that needs our attention. Kind of if you have lung cancer, you go to the doctor and get something for it. For the cough, that's helpful. But don't forget the bigger issue is cancer. And so there are some practical things we want to do to address the problems we have culturally or within ourselves. There are things that I might need to do differently to change some areas of my life. Practical steps I can take, whether I'm a Christian or not. Things I have to change to get better. But if I give attention to those things and ignore the spiritual side, then that's a problem. Some have worked hard to have a good marriage. They've done all the seminars, they've read all the books, they've studied all the online help, they participated in all of the 7 secrets of a successful marriage, and it helps some. And yet there's a disconnect. There's not the intimacy that you really want to have. I'm telling you, all those things you did are good things, but there is a deeper thing. That there is a spiritual element that you can't underestimate, and an enemy. And because our battle is not against flesh and blood, what that means is we don't fight with flesh and blood weapons. Remember we said that last Sunday? The Apostle Paul talks about this in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 3 and 4. He says, "For though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does." The weapons we fight with are not weapons of the world. On the contrary, our weapons have divine power to demolish strongholds. See, if we used worldly weapons, then we would use things like anger and hate. Anybody ever pull those out? And when someone attacks us, we would attack them back. When someone mistreats us, we mistreat them. You offend me and I'll offend you. If we're using worldly weapons, then we get defensive. We don't respond with compassion and kindness. We use harshness and bitterness. Because we still make the mistake that that's the enemy. But we don't wage war as the world does. You might think the way that you break down strongholds of human reasoning is to get on an endless battle on social media. Good luck with that. Instead, we have God's power to demolish strongholds. Jesus says if you have an issue with a stronghold, you pray about it. And if someone curses you, you bless them. That's the weapon we have. If someone takes advantage of you and says, carry this 1 mile, you go 2. Get hit on one cheek, turn the other. Now that might seem like we're giving up and we're losing ground, and yet this is the way that the war was ultimately won. Folks, Jesus on the cross demonstrated love and humility and sacrifice. And this is what destroys these powers. The moment that we pick up hate or anger or contempt, we're no longer fighting against the enemy, we're fighting for the enemy. And we're fighting a battle that we didn't even see. And so our battle is not against flesh and blood, it's against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. So we want to pray that God would open our eyes to that. Because sometimes it's really hard to see, especially when we've been offended. See, the offense is the bait of Satan. If he can get you offended, if he can make you angry, then he's got a foothold. And then you start to confuse who the enemy is, and you start to pick up weapons, and then he's won. Folks, your enemy is not your unbelieving spouse who's making fun of you for being at church this morning. Your enemy is not the college professor who belittles your faith and tells you that it's for weak-minded people. Your enemy is not the person your child is dating who tries to undermine everything you've tried to teach them. Your real enemy is not the coworker who gossips about you. It's not the ex-wife who cheated or the ex-husband who was abusive. They aren't your enemies. They are victims of the enemy. As a church, our enemies are not Muslim extremists or an activist judge. Our enemy is not flesh and blood. Yeah, Paul teaches us we don't wage war as the world does. Ephesians 6:11 says, put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. And the word schemes here really is translated methods. Put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's methods. And it applies to something very specific rather than just generic. The idea that if you are a follower of Jesus, that you have been targeted, that there is a strategy in place to separate you from God. Devil uses 2 primary things to do that. He uses temptation and he uses accusation. He loves those things, temptation and accusation. And they're always rooted, remember, temptation and accusations are always rooted in lies. Lies about you, lies about God. And Satan has strategies to deploy these weapons of temptation and accusations. I wanted to look at a couple of those so we need not be unaware of the devil's schemes. I'll use some military terms to help us with these. And the first strategy is to divide and conquer. The devil uses this a lot within the church. He knows if he can separate and divide us on things that are matters of interpretation or preference, then we're vulnerable. And so divide and conquer is definitely a strategy. Another we see is blitzkrieg. Anybody know the term blitzkrieg? War term. Yeah, it's this using a concentrated force that comes quickly and just at the right time. And maybe you can identify with this, like you didn't see it coming. In fact, maybe you thought you were really okay here, and so you let down your guard. You say things like, I'll never cheat on my wife. And then at that sales meeting with a colleague. And then when that message comes from a past girlfriend on social media. And maybe you still can't believe it happened. Here's another strategy the enemy uses. It's called to counter. Remember that we're on the offensive. So Satan counters. You may be tired of banging at the gates. And in that moment of tired, Satan counters. Remember Job's wife? Yeah, she starts out doing pretty well in the book of Job. But her pretty well wears off. And she eventually tells Job to curse God and die. And maybe that's where you're at. You were doing pretty well in offense against the gates of hell, and then, well, it was in remission, and now it's back. Satan's saying, stop banging at my gates. Here's another strategy the enemy uses. Anyone ever hear the term shock and awe? This is when you're so shocked by the means of the enemy that your fear causes you to quit. Spouse leaves out of nowhere. Love of your life. That just found somebody else. Maybe it's a diagnosis, one without a medical cure. So shocked, so scared. You're down and out. The enemy will also use the strategy of the Trojan horse. Remember where the Greeks conquer the ancient city of Troy by giving them this huge wooden horse? And they think it's a peace offering, so they bring it inside the gates of the city. And at night, Greek soldiers come out of the horse and attack the city from the inside. Enemy loves that strategy. Enemy loves attacking from the inside. You get something that you think is good. This is what I've always wanted. This is the position I always wanted to be in. This is what I've been missing out on. And it satisfies the desires of our heart. But sometimes it's just show me the bait and hide the hook. I always wanted wealth, and now I have wealth. Well, lost my marriage and my family in getting it, but it's what I always wanted. I know a guy who made it all the way to the top of his corporation, CEO. And what he is wealthy and alone. And what he is spiritually lost. I think distraction is another strategy. If your attention is somewhere else, you may be vulnerable. Where's our attention? See, sometimes we think we're on a playground, so we don't notice the battle that's being waged all around us. And we need to understand these things in order to be prepared for them. Because sometimes it's obvious where we know it's spiritual warfare. Other times we have a hard time recognizing or seeing it. Before I started this series, I was talking to a colleague about preaching on spiritual warfare, and he said, Steve, you ready for that? Yeah, why? Well, just be prepared for the attack. Nah, I'm good. Got to tell you, it's been a strange couple of weeks for me. I had 2 issues to deal with in my secular job that in 30 years I've never had to deal with these kind of issues. Really heavy stuff. People's lives, people's jobs at stake. All on me to be judge and jury. And twice this week I had the preacher dream. People will tell you of a dream they have of being at a ceremony and finding out they're completely naked. Anybody have that dream? Come on, raise your... Here's the preacher dream, though. It's being in the pulpit and finding out you're completely naked. Mine is a variation of that. Mine is arriving somewhere to preach and being completely unprepared. Usually with a big crowd. Usually with a crowd of people I don't know. And I'm completely unprepared. And I don't know why. And I've forgotten my notes and I've forgotten my Bible. I guess I'm okay with being naked. It's not having the other stuff that... You don't know how frightening that dream is to me. I had a variation of that dream twice this week. And in my mind, I'm not connecting this to a sermon series. Actually, I'm connecting it to the burrito that I ate at Taco Bell. Wednesday, I was about a third done on my message when my computer just shut down. Lost everything. Blink. Had to start over. So if you think your computer is demon-possessed, if it's not a Mac, it probably is. I got 2 messages this week from Sarah telling me she's going to be staying at the Hampton Inn near where I work. And although we never met, I should text her back if I'm interested in getting together. The FBI also sent me several messages this week telling me that a warrant was about to be issued for my arrest. And I could stop it by sending them money to pay my fines that I don't have. I sent them a message back. I couldn't help myself. I told them my picture's already in the post office, so their warrant is the least of my concerns. Had a terrible time sleeping this week. I've been dealing with gout for 2 weeks. Usually I get a flare-up of gout and it lasts a couple days. This evening will be 2 weeks. Still dealing with it. It's better, but anybody ever have a tough time sleeping? It drains you. I couldn't sleep. Driving home Friday night from the Milton area was a nightmare. Let's say it's an hour and a half drive. I had to pull over 2 times to sleep. When I finally got home, 5 hours later, I pulled into my driveway, I shut off the car, and I just sat there for a few minutes. And then at that point I thought, I wonder if there's more to all of this. More than just the physical flesh and blood side of life. And I began to fight a different kind of battle. And I started to pray out loud, sitting in my car in my driveway. It is so helpful for me to pray out loud. So I asked God to lead me in battle, to have me keep banging at the gates. Now you may say that what I just described sounds like vacation compared to how the enemy is coming at you and your family. The Bible tells us that we stand firm not only in our own strength, but we stand firm in the mighty power of God. That's the power to demolish strongholds. And so by prayer and with the gospel and by grace and worship, by gathering together with other believers who encourage us, who can hold us up in prayer, we stay strong in the Lord. And we fight the real enemy. 2 Kings chapter 6 has one of my favorite stories that captures this. I wanted us to look at verse 15. We read about the king of Aram, who was an enemy of Israel and wanted to destroy the prophet Elisha, one of the prophets of God. So he sends his entire army to kill this one prophet and his servant. You would think, way overkill. So they find what house he's in and they just surround him and his servant. Verse 15, when the servant of the man of God is Elijah. So this is Elijah's servant. When the servant of the man of God got up and went out early the next morning, an army with horses and chariots had surrounded the city. Oh no, my lord, what shall we do? The servant asked. Elisha responds with these incredible words. Verse 16. Don't be afraid, the prophet answered. What? We're surrounded. Those who are with us are more than those who are with them. Those who are with us are more than those who are with them. And the servant is like looking around and there's no one with us. There's no one with us. It's just you and me. And there's this army and we're surrounded and it's just the two of us. And in verse 17, Elisha prayed, "Open his eyes, Lord, so that he may see." Then the Lord opened the servant's eyes, and he looked, and he saw the hills full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. I don't want you to miss this in verse 16. Elijah says, "Those who are with us are more than those who are with them." It doesn't say those who are with us are more than them. It says those who are with us are more than those who are with them. You see, what is being described here is a spiritual battle. There are those who are with us, and there are those who are with them. And Elisha prays, "Open my servant's eyes that he may see." And that's what I want us to pray for as a church. That we would recognize that there is an enemy, but that we would also recognize that those who are with us are greater than those who are with them. That we would understand that our power and our strength is found in Jesus the Christ, and our victory is certain. So we don't have to be afraid. That we can live with courage and confidence because of the power of Jesus. So if you're on a playground, come on to the battleground. For those who are a little weary, pray for God's strength. Pray for it out loud. Have this group of believers hold you up in prayer as encouragement and love. That's why we pray for one another. That's why we're such a praying church. If you're surrounded by the enemy, those who are with you are more than those who are with them. God asks us to fight the battle that we can't see. Let's pray. Father, thank you for the truth of your word. Thank you for reminding us that our fight isn't against flesh and blood, but we are in a battle. My God, help us to fight the real enemy. And help us to do it in your power, in your might. For in your power, we are always greater. We pray this